privileged to have the opportunity to provide the introductory address for this conference, for this symposium. And what I wanted to say at the outset is that I'm very much a student of religion. I've always been a student of religion. And I've been a student of actually all of the Dharmic traditions that are represented here. And this particular symposium has given me an opportunity, and it was a great opportunity, to be able to interact across the spectrum with the different Dharmic traditions that are represented across our city. And perhaps if we didn't have this symposium, I may not have had that opportunity. So I feel actually very privileged to be able to be given this opportunity to be able to meet my fellow panelists, as well as to be able to learn about their different traditions. And hopefully these interactions will continue into the future. I really hope for that. I was asked to give an overview, an introduction to the Dharmic traditions, and my focus will be on concepts and ideas as a segue actually into the other speakers' presentations. And so there will be some overlap, but hopefully the overlap will be not as significant enough so that each individual speaker will be able to elaborate on their own particular religious tradition. So when you look when you look at ancient Indian history, which is the reason that we talk about India as the kind of the genesis of this, is that the Dharmic traditions that are represented here all come out of the Indian subcontinent, and they've all evolved from that standpoint. So when you look at Indian history, early cities of India, the history goes back thousands of years, so at least 6,000, 7,000 years. They developed along what was called the Indus and Saraswati rivers. Many of you may have studied in your history books about the Indus River or the Indus Valley civilization, and thought to be before Common Era about 5,000 years. And there was this civilization called Harappan civilization, which this civilization is currently, or the archaeological remains are currently in Pakistan today. But essentially, this civilization has been extensively studied. This was a very advanced civilization at its prime. The cities, the infrastructure was well developed. They had drainage systems. They were a very evolved culture. We know from the study of ancient Indian art and science, and I'm going to discuss a little bit of this as we go into the talk, these were very, very, very highly developed systems of philosophy and application. And we know that by about 600 before Common Era, that there was a development of a kind of common culture throughout the Indian subcontinent. Now, when I talk about India, remember that present-day India is actually different from what I'm thinking of as India in those days, which includes Pakistan, which includes Bangladesh, which includes Nepal, and actually this culture eventually had actually spread to large parts of Southeast Asia also, based on current evidence from archaeological things and also current existing temples and other religious sites. So Indian self-understanding, I find this to be a very fascinating topic, and this is probably a couple hours talk in itself, and just as an overview, I wanted to present the ideas of how Indians developed self-understanding and what are all the different ideas that had come out of India. So the major religious texts of the Hindus are the Vedas. These are scriptural texts, as well as texts that explain how people should behave. There are medicinal texts, and these texts were actually memorized. This is a completely oral tradition. There's a concept of pramana, which deals with different aspects of self-inquiry. Moksha, which is a concept of liberation or release from the body and reaching a divine reality, which from the Hindu conception was Brahman, and also in the other spiritual traditions can be referred to by different names. Dharma, which I'm going to describe in detail in a slide. Karma, which I'm going to describe. Janma actually means birth, and the question is what is is the purpose of birth and the idea of reincarnation. And Brahman is the concept of a reality. It's actually different than the concept in Abrahamic religions of God, because this deals specifically with the concept of a super consciousness and a super energy, which you can refer to it as God, but it probably has a little bit of a different conception. Darshana is actually the idea of worship of God and worship of God in different manifestations. Vedanta is a study of self-inquiry and self-knowledge. Sankhya, yoga, which is very popular in the mainstream, but in the Indian subcontinent context was actually used as a vehicle for preparing the body for spiritual study and for spiritual progress, and not simply as an exercise. And Mimamsa, there's a lot of different things. I won't cover everything, but you can see that all of the different religious traditions represented here are actually part of the development of Indian self-understanding. So Sikhism is actually the youngest religious philosophy that comes out of the Indian subcontinent that's represented here. But these are all great spiritual traditions that we have been exposed to. So in these other ideas, Advaita, Dvaita, these are all different schools of thinking of how the individual and their relationship to God is represented. And even the concepts here that are represented called Astika, and there's another concept called Nastika. Actually, Nastika represents an idea of actually, in a sense, maybe even thinking of no God. And Astika is a concept of God worship. So there's lots of different ideas and there was tremendous freedom of understanding and freedom of worship. So this is from 7000 before Common Era to 1700s. Dharmic traditions, just as a general definition, is that these are traditions that have originated from the Indian subcontinent over several millennia. These traditions all have a breadth of tradition. There's a range of experiences. They all are very beautiful traditions in and of themselves. Many of you have heard this word Sanatana Dharma. Many of you may not have heard of the word Sanatana Dharma, but many times this is used to characterize or to place these philosophies in a certain context. And from the Hinduism perspective, Sanatana Dharma means an eternal path or an eternal truth. It can represent actually the essential thought consciousness, actually, or the thought process of Indian civilization. And it's not just one idea. It's actually a conglomeration of ideas that it's religious, philosophical, and cultural ideas that span belief in reincarnation, a certain path to righteousness, meaning a path of behavior of a human being, and the desire to liberate from a cycle of births and rebirths. So reincarnation is a very fundamental component to the evolution of the individual in the Dharmic traditions. So it's an exponential path. So what that means is that each individual can experience these truths in their own way, which is why there is actually a multiplicity and a freedom of thought that is given to individuals to say, well, you don't exactly have to follow it this specific way. Your relationship with God is a certain relationship, and that may be different than mine, but that's okay. There is an understanding of the soul's relationship to God, and the understanding that God and the soul are one and inseparable, meaning that everybody is trying to make, all human beings are trying to make that mission to God, and God is the creator of the world, or that great spirit is the creator of the world, and we are all trying to make that journey to merge with that great consciousness. Karma is a term that many have used in the mainstream. You hear it a lot. You'll hear it on TV. People talk about it in daily discussions. It's a principle of universal cause and effect that generates and governs our actions. At its very fundamental level, it's really an energy. It's an energy that we transmit, and it's a transmission in terms of words, it's a transmission in terms of deeds, and it's also a thought process. So if you think negatively, you can generate negative karmas based on the thought processes or the thought perceptions of the Dharmic traditions. But if you think positively, you have, positive thoughts, of course, would be you're helping others or you're doing something for somebody else. These can generate good karma. So the idea of generating good and bad karmas is there. One thing that that this karmic thought process does is that it actually places the human being at the center of responsibility for their spiritual progress. So obviously, if you generate bad karmas, that particular soul will be on a certain cycle of reincarnation, and maybe next time around it will not be as privileged as it was in this particular birth. So it provides that responsibility to each individual human being for their particular spiritual pathway. So I just put this up there, in mainstream culture, Sandra Bullock, she said, I'm a true believer in karma. You get what you give, whether it's good or bad. That's one way of thinking about it, and that's certainly, it is akin to the thought process that is presented in scriptural texts. Dharma is a more complicated, probably, topic to explain, and as a student of religion, the way I would think about it is that it is the basic foundation of life. It provides an opportunity for people to practice righteousness, morality, religion, whatever that religious pathway is. It's a spiritual journey, a certain type of responsibility, and this is a responsibility to themselves and how they take care of themselves, a responsibility to others, and a responsibility to the world in general, also meaning the earth and how the earth is respected, because that is actually a reflection of the will of superconsciousness also, and a certain duty. What are your duties in society? This is also Dharma. So it's a word that actually has a very significant connotation. So when you hear people use the word Dharma, it can be used in many different contexts. So just understand it in that way. It's a moral law that's, when combined with spiritual discipline, that guides one's life. It provides you an idea of how to pursue what would be considered right thought, right speech, and right action. So how you would pursue those particular things in your daily life. There's a concept of reincarnation, which I kind of touched on. In Sanskrit, the word is called punarjanma. And in this, the soul is immortal and doesn't die. And basically, it is a cycle of birth and rebirth until the individual has reached Brahman. And as I said, Brahman is not just the word God. It's actually a much higher concept. The eventual purpose of life is actually to understand and to serve God. And it incorporates actually the principles of karma and dharma, meaning your cycle of reincarnation or how you are reincarnating is dependent on how your actions have been and on how past actions influence future birth and so on. So you kind of get the idea, but they're all interdependent ideas. So this is something from the Hindu text, and this is from Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the spiritual texts of the Hindus, considered many times to be the synopsis or essence of a lot of Hindu ideas. So death is certain for all that is born, and birth for all that dies. Therefore, for what is unavoidable, you should not be distressed. So suggesting that you need to, that the cycle of birth and death in the Dharmic tradition idea is that we know that you're going to be born and that you're going to die. So this is not something you should necessarily feel distressed about, because this is the natural cycle of existence. This is a very famous Hindu saint who actually had a lot of interreligious kind of background. So he said, when we are born, we cry, so meaning we ourselves, the baby cries, and the world rejoices. In contrast, when we die, we laugh, in the sense that if you are a person with true understanding and you understand the cycle of life, of birth and rebirth, you laugh, and it's not that big a deal. But the world cries because you're gone, because they necessarily don't understand. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit just because I'm a medical person, and I was also asked to introduce a couple of medical ideas that are part of the Dharmic traditions and the Indian subcontinent idea. So many of you may have heard of Ayurveda, some may not have heard of Ayurveda. There are actually Ayurveda practitioners in the United States, and essentially Ayurveda is a system of Indian medicine. It's a holistic medical system, so it's been validated by observation, inquiry, direct examination, and comes out of thousands of years of experience. It is used to maintain and improve health as well as to cure different types of diseases. And it has distinct differences from allopathy. It's based on the constitution and condition of a person, and people are given both medicines and also advice about lifestyle and food and other different, even spiritual practices. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more depth. But it balances mind, body, and soul for a perfect health condition. So it looks at synchrony of the body from both a physical and a spiritual state, actually. It's been practiced in India for over 5,000 years. For anybody from any tradition in India, Ayurveda is well known. It's not just from a Hindu perspective. So as I've spoken to a lot of people from different backgrounds from India, this many times is actually the first thing that many people go to or look at because it's highly respected. It covers all medical fields. A lot of observation in this is physical exam, touching and questioning, feeling the pulse, and it basically has many different components to disease management, as I've kind of outlined there. Clinical exam includes pulse diagnosis, urine examination, stool examination, tongue examination, body sounds, eye examination, skin examination, total assessment. It's very similar to what you would do with allopathy, but it has some very specific differences. It means it's a combination of two Sanskrit words. Ayu means long life, Ved means knowledge. So knowledge or science of life would be one way to translate this. It's got four main parts listed there. So Shodhan, Shaman, Rasayan, Sattva, Jaya. So these are all different pathways in the care of the Ayurvedic doctor for the patient. So I just wanted to touch briefly on one of the great Ayurvedic surgeons, and there are historical texts from India that speak about how Ayurveda was used in surgery. So this particular surgeon named Sushruta is a surgeon of ancient India, and he performed all different types of surgeries that are performed today. So laparotomies. Here he's doing actually an earlobe or earlobe lobectomy, problems with benign prostatic hypertrophy, all different types of surgeries were performed. And so there was a great understanding in ancient India about the body and about how surgical practices could be used for alleviation of different types of ills of the body. So this is just an example, but as I said, there's a very large text, which is also a spiritual text that talks about his work. And then many of these texts actually, as time went on, were translated actually into other languages. I read that actually this was translated actually into Arabic in the 8th century. And some of these techniques were basically taken to other countries because of their greatness in terms of their approach. So one of the last things that I'll touch on in this talk is the common thread for a lot of the Dharmic civilizations is Sanskrit. Sanskrit is I'm privileged actually in Dallas to actually now be a student who is starting to learn this ancient Indian language through a local program here. But essentially this language is a common language of religious worship for many of the traditions presented here. Specifically, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism specifically use a lot of Sanskrit. And the Europeans, probably about 300 years ago or so, were really very intrigued by Sanskrit. People who are philologists, these are people that study language. This particular gentleman, Sir William Jones, was a student of ancient India. He was part of the British East India Company. He actually lived in India for a period of time, and he made a very startling discovery that Sanskrit and European languages are intimately related. And a lot of research has now, demonstrated these, and I'm going to show a couple of slides about that. But it's very interesting if you read his quotation here. The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Yet bearing to both of them a sort of affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. So the question was that he was trying to examine what are the relationships between these languages, and what he found in the study of Sanskrit was that this language was actually a very, very fine-tuned language, so precise that he was amazed by it in terms of their relationships. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples. I thought it would be interesting for the audience to see what are these relationships. So in Sanskrit we have a verb root called vid, and so many words can be formed. There's a word called vidya, which means knowledge, science, and learning. And then if you put an in front of it, many times this becomes this becomes not. So avidya means to not know or to have ignorance. And in Veda, which is a form of knowing or seeing. This is a religious text. This is a sacred body of knowledge. So this is that verb root. So when you look at Latin and you look at the word roots and you look at English, which a lot of words come out of Latin, and you look at Greek, many times you're going to see a significant homology, a significant relationship between all those languages. So another word, which is in Sanskrit, the root is jna, which is jnana and jnana, jnani. These are knowers or seekers. If you look at Latin and you look at English, the word know, and then gnosis in Greek, you'll understand that these ancient civilizations actually had a lot of contact with each other, and there was a significant relationship with them. Unfortunately, we don't understand a lot of those relationships because a lot of history is not recorded, but that's important. So here's just words, What I was always struck with, I guess, and before I began the study of religion and Sanskrit and things was that, in a lot of languages, this concept of this ma and pa, right? So in Sanskrit, the words are matri, like matri, pitar, these words, and these are mother and father. In languages, you'll see that there's a significant relationship across the board, and even the sounds ma and pa, they're actually across all languages as mother and father. So there's been there's a significant relationship across words. So I think that's very important for people to recognize when you look at the Dharmic traditions, that these traditions, there's a continuity over time with other cultures. So I'm going to end here, and I just wanted to say that, the Dharmic traditions are very synergized. The practice may be different, the cultural practice, the culture may be different across different countries, but in the background there is a significant synergy, and it was a great opportunity for me to participate in this. Thank you.